In 1885, France established its first presence in a region that would later form part of the present-day country of Laos. Then over the course of the late 19th to early 20th centuries, further territorial expansions, acquisitions, and mergers allowed France to form the Protectorate of Laos under the nominal rule of a monarchy. French Laos formed part of French Indochina, which included Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China, and Cambodia. During World War II, French Indochina fell to the Japanese forces and was governed first by the collaborationist French Vichy colonial authorities and later directly by Japan. In October 1945, at the end of World War II, Laotian nationalists declared independence under a revolutionary government called Lao Isara. However, French forces soon returned to Laos, subdued the Lao Isara, reinstated the monarchy, and regained control of Laos. But then, France reversed its earlier position of restoring colonial rule and instead prepared to grant self-rule to Laos, which it did in May 1947, where Laos became an autonomous state within the French Union. In 1950, with France again confirming Laos's self-determination status, the United States and Britain recognized Laos as a sovereign state. But despite Laos's apparent independence, France retained a stranglehold on the country, controlling Laos's finance, defense, and major foreign policy decisions. Meanwhile, the nationalist Lao Isara, which had fled to Thailand after its defeat, disbanded in 1947, with the politically moderate Suvarnabhuma soon returning to Laos and eventually becoming its prime minister in 1951. The Marxist Souphanouvong moved to Vietnam, where he met with Ho Chi Minh and other Viet Minh leaders. Souphanouvong also co-founded the Pathet Lao, a communist political and militia organization that put great efforts to portray itself as ideologically and politically inclusive, but was in fact controlled behind the scenes by hardline communists. In large part, the Laotian Civil War was a result of events taking place in neighboring Vietnam, first during the First Indochina War and later during the Vietnam War. In 1953, in the midst of the First Indochina War, the Viet Minh invaded northeastern Laos to lure French colonial forces to overextend their lines. The Viet Minh then allowed the Pathet Lao to occupy these areas to portray the invasion as having been launched by the Lao revolutionaries themselves. In July 1954, the First Indochina War ended with the Geneva Accords. French Indochina was dissolved, French forces departed from the region, and Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam became independent states, with the latter divided into Communist North Vietnam and West-aligned South Vietnam. The accords also stipulated that Laos and Cambodia were to remain neutral in regional, political, and military issues. In Laos, the government and Pathet Lao held a series of talks that led in August 1956 to the formation of a coalition government. Laos officially took a non-aligned policy in the now raging Cold War by forming an all-inclusive coalition government. However, this neutralist approach was quickly undermined by Cold War dynamics. More ominously for Laos, North Vietnamese forces remained in northeastern Laos and soon expanded into the southeastern region, where in 1959 they began construction of a supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to South Vietnam. By then, Laos was caught up in the emerging conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, commonly known as the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese also continued to secretly arm and train the Pathet Lao, whose aim was to overthrow the Laotian government. In August 1958 in Laos, neutralist Prime Minister Suvarnabhuma was ousted and replaced with a right-wing government that suppressed the left-wing faction, leading to the end of the coalition government. Consequently, in 1959, fighting restarted between Lao government forces and the Pathet Lao. In the capital, Vientiane, political turmoil continued, with coups, counter-coups, and even armed battles being fought between neutralist and rightist forces. In the aftermath, in 1960, a right-wing government came to power, and the United States increased financial assistance to the government and military support to the Laotian army as well as the Hmong guerrillas, its secret army. However, in 1961, at the urging of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, 14 nations including the major powers met in Geneva for a negotiated settlement of Laos's neutrality. This led in 1962 to the signing of the Geneva Accords, where all parties agreed to respect the neutrality of Laos. Consequently, in Laos, another coalition government was formed comprising neutralists, rightists, and leftists. The cords were quickly broken as the now raging Vietnam War put great pressure on Laos's fragile neutrality. In 1963, a strong Viet Cong push nearly brought down the South Vietnamese government. The North Vietnamese stepped up their activities in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the United States increased its support to the Laotian Army and Hmong militia. In Vientiane, the coalition government remained fractured as mutual distrust and high tensions remained among the neutralist, rightist, and leftist factions. Then in 1964, following two coup attempts by right-wing forces, the Pathet Lao broke ties with Suvarnabhumu's neutralist regime, ending the coalition government, and fighting soon restarted. In 1965, the US military intervened directly in Vietnam, leading to the most intense phase of the Vietnam War. Consequently, US bombing attacks in eastern Laos increased substantially. Despite massive US air power, the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to expand and North Vietnamese Pathet Lao forces gradually increased their areas of control. In 1968, the Royal Lao Army suffered a crushing defeat from a powerful North Vietnamese Pathet Lao offensive and thereafter ceased to be a major player in the war. Thereafter, the ground fighting on the government side was borne almost exclusively by the Hmong Secret Army that in 1968 to 1971 engaged the North Vietnamese Pathet Lao in a series of seesaw battles for control of the strategic plain of Jars that saw some of the most intense fighting of the war. But by 1972, North Vietnamese Pathet Lao forces were firmly in control of the plain of Jars and had captured the Bolovens Plateau and were advancing on the Mekong region and threatening Tha Kek and Vientiane. The end of the Laotian Civil War paralleled the end of the Vietnam War and developments in Indochina in the early 1970s. Following difficult negotiations from 1968 to 1972, in January 1973, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords, which ostensibly ended the Vietnam War. The United States withdrew its remaining forces from Vietnam, but fighting soon restarted between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In Laos, similar negotiations in 1972 between the Lao government and Pathet Lao led to a peace treaty, including a ceasefire and the formation of a third coalition government with neutralist Suvarnabhuma and Marxist Souphanouvong sharing equal powers. But by then, with the US withdrawal, the political and military situation in Indochina had changed considerably, with the Communists now holding the balance of power. In Indochina in 1975, the Communists launched their final offensives, with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia capturing the capital, Phnom Penh, on April 17th, and North Vietnamese forces entering South Vietnam's capital, Saigon, on April 30th, ending the Vietnam War. In Laos, in late April 1975, the Pathet Lao launched an offensive that captured Hmong mountain strongholds and cleared the way for the Communist advance to the Mekong lowlands. Prime Minister Suvarnabhuma, wishing to avoid further bloodshed and destruction in a lost cause, ordered his forces not to resist the Pathet Lao. The Hmong, now isolated, began a desperate evacuation to Thailand, particularly since the North Vietnamese Pathet Lao had vowed to eradicate the Hmong who had long prevented the Communists from achieving total victory in Laos. In May 1975, Communist-led anti-government demonstrations broke out in many locations in Laos, which paved the way for Pathet Lao forces to enter many towns and cities without resistance and seize control of the local governments. The Pathet Lao captured the royal capital, Luang Prabang, in June 1975 and Vientiane in August. In the following weeks, Laos's third coalition government was dissolved as the Pathet Lao consolidated power. On December 2, 1975, Laos was declared a one-party socialist state and the 600-year-old monarchy was abolished. The now socialist Laos became closely associated with and subordinate to Vietnam and cut ties with its other geographical neighbors, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, and also with China. In the lead-up to the Pathet Lao victory, thousands of civilians, including high-ranking government officials, military officers, and rightist supporters, fearing for their lives, fled and crossed the Mekong River into Thailand. In this way, some 10% of the Lao population left the country. Rightist elements who had failed to leave, including tens of thousands of former government officials and employees, military personnel, businessmen, and other reactionaries, were sent to so-called seminar camps for political indoctrination and forced labor. The former king and his family were sent to one such seminar camp where he, his wife, and eldest son died under unclear circumstances.